Okay, let's jump on in. So today's topic, we're talking about, who benefits from assessment in the early years. I want to start by saying I think we have a common interest, whether we are government wanting to monitor the system, whether we're researchers or evaluators looking at programs, whether we're educators in classrooms, or whether we're families with children who go to early childhood programs. Our focus really is on, are children growing and developing well, and are we supporting them to do that? So I think we come from a common interest, and we have a good reason to be interested in children's learning. By the simple fact that everyone is here, I think we have this shared understanding of the importance of supporting children's early learning and development. I think we probably are reasonably well across the research that says that there is this great promise of early childhood programs, that they have the ability to support children's learning and development, to lift all children's growth and development, their learning, but most importantly, to reduce achievement gaps that we attribute to inequality. We've got a generation of research now that tells us that when we get the mix right, high quality programs, that children don't have significant barriers to accessing, children benefit, and those gaps between children from the least advantaged and most advantaged backgrounds narrow. But we haven't got it right yet. So when we look around the world, not just in Australia, not just in Indonesia, when we look at the systems that we deploy, often in markets, we aren't seeing this great promise being realized. So children are not necessarily all being supported to learn optimally, and we're certainly not seeing a narrowing of achievement gaps that we attribute to inequality, to disadvantage. And just before I jump into more talk about assessment, I just want to show you some evidence about that. This is a picture that my colleagues tell me never ever to show because it's overly technical and people don't get it, but I love it. I'm going to spend a bit of time running you through it, and hopefully I'll make my point. This is from some research we did in Australia a few years ago now, where we went into the everyday childcare and preschool market in Australia, and measured the quality, or the teaching quality that we observed in classrooms. What we've done here along the x-axis is we've chunked this up into observations of quality in programs in the lowest 20% of neighbourhood SES. So these are the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods, up to the 5th quintile of SES, the most advantaged neighbourhoods. What I want you to take from this is these black bars through the middle of each box. This is the 50th quintile, the average level of quality we observed in these classrooms. The boxes around them each represent 50% of the observations. So the box is the majority of observations of quality. In Australia, we see this trajectory where children who attend programs in the least advantaged neighbourhoods experience lower quality, lower teaching quality on average than children in the most advantaged neighbourhoods. But perhaps more significantly than that, research from the US would tell us that there's some minimal level of teaching quality that we need to observe before we have expectations that programs will have positive impact on children's learning and development. And this red dashed bar through the plot is this minimum threshold that was observed in the US. Above this line, we would expect classrooms to have some positive impact, an effect size of 0.017 up to 0.035. Below this line, we don't expect to see a positive impact. So the takeaway from this plot is that in Australia, in everyday early childhood programs, most programs are not high enough quality that we'd expect them to have a positive impact on children's learning. It's another plot that I want to show just before we speak more about assessment. This was the same study, and here I've got a plot of children's age on the x-axis and children's verbal ability, their learning, on the y-axis, learning within the domain of verbal ability. This black dot through the middle is the normative expectation. This is the typical trajectory that we would expect children to take. And in this study, we met about 2,500, 3,000 children. We took an initial observation of their verbal ability, and each of these lines represents the development trajectory on average of children who were initially the highest achievers. So these are the children who were the highest achievers when we first met them. And we see that they're learning over 5 years in this case, 3 years in this case, kept them typically above the normative expectation. These were the children who we met who were in the lowest achieving group. These children, when they were 3 and 4 when we first met them, were the lowest achievers, the lowest 20% of achievers. And the takeaway here is that they remained not only the lowest achievers in our study, but they deviated away. They drifted away from our typical expectation of development for age. You can see that there with these lines here. So the reason I wanted to show you these two plots was just to reinforce that pattern that we certainly see in Australia, and I think is typically found in research in other countries, that the everyday, the typical early childhood system isn't yet delivering on its promise, right? When we put these barriers in front of families, barriers of access, barriers of quality, we're not quite getting it right. So that brings me back to this common interest. Certainly around the world, government is getting more and more interested in early childhood. The investment is increasing. We certainly buy into the great promise of early childhood programs. Most of the efforts are around increasing access, particularly to preschool learning. And we'll talk about the global agenda to achieve this in a minute. But what path I want you to take down here in your thinking is, whilst we have this shared interest in the best possible outcomes for young children's learning and development, perhaps our motivation for why we want to measure it and why we want to collect data differs depending who we are. And certainly government and researchers' reason for wanting to know a lot about children's learning is to know about the effectiveness of the system monitoring and evaluation. Probably the most significant framework for monitoring early learning and for measuring early learning comes from the Sustainable Development Goal 4.2.1 agenda, which asks countries to monitor and to report children's development in terms of their health, learning, and psychosocial well-being. Right, so we want to know what proportion of children meet some minimum development standard at age 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. You also mentioned in your introduction there, I also sit on the Australian Commonwealth Preschool Outcome Measurement Advisory Group. The Australian government is also interested in measuring children's learning in the preschool year. And certainly part of the reason it wants to do that is to know, as a system, are we doing a good job in terms of supporting children's learning when they finish preschool and make the transition to school? And I guess that kind of brings me to this idea that we have a tension, right? We might share a common interest in terms of wanting all children to get the best start in life, to learn and to develop. But certainly depending where we come from, whether we are government and evaluation people, research people, or whether we are educators in classrooms or families, there's this tension. Certainly from one perspective, we're interested in headline indicators, what proportion of children can do a certain skill that we decide is very, very important. Um, and I'm going to argue here that this has led us down a pathway where the assessments we've developed and the assessments we typically use in early childhood actually don't look very educational. And I'm going to make the argument that they're not very helpful for educators and their core business of supporting children's learning and development. And in fact, I think it's not unsurprising to know that, in fact, some measures that have been developed and are used in the early years actually exclude educators. Those of you who come from a clinical psychology background will be aware that there are measures that we use to capture cognitive skills of children, behavioral skills, that are only to be used by people with clinical qualifications. And in fact, a teacher couldn't buy them, let alone use them in their classroom. And I think the point I want to make here is that that's a strange outcome in a world where we do think, like was said in the introduction, that learning and assessment is something that can go hand in hand. So here's a picture. This is from the ECDI 2030. This is UNICEF's measure of SDG 4.2.1. UNICEF is the custodian of that Sustainable Development Goal. And it has published a measure that is encouraged to be used in survey work within countries to decide, are children developmentally on track for learning, health, and psychosocial well-being. You can see here that the focus is on asking parents mostly whether children can or cannot, whether they can or cannot do a bunch of minimal skills. Can they write their name? Can they recognize numbers? Can they count using objects? I think you can see that these are naturally very useful if a country is mostly interested in headline indicators. Can I report the number of 2-year-olds who can jump with 2 feet together? But this would be less helpful for an educator in a classroom who's trying to think about how to best support children's motor development. And in fact, I would argue that it would be very rare for an educator to use a measure like this in the classroom. Similarly, this is from the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. This is one of those kind of instruments that is wildly popular with researchers. I'm very guilty of using it in a lot of research. And again, it's a questionnaire style measure of behavior, externalizing behavior, internalizing behavior, where we ask families and teachers to indicate whether children do or do not do these kinds of things, whether they lose their temper, where they have many worries. Again, very useful for researchers. These kind of outcomes, when we sum them up, are strongly correlated with things like family SES and participation in early childhood programs. But I think, again, not something that an educator would find particularly useful, and certainly not something that would be embedded in their everyday practice. So I think we have to ask ourselves, why do we really do assessment in the early years? If we're going to do a better job of measuring learning, if we're going to shake things up a little bit, I think we have to come back to the core business of what is assessment. And, in this case, children and adults are at the center of assessment. Why do we do it? Well, we want educators to be collecting evidence about what children can do, collecting evidence of children's growth, and we want them to use that to make purposeful decisions. So often that'll be couched in terms of teaching at the right level, but certainly it's about selecting curriculum materials and pedagogical strategies that are appropriate for children where they are today. And of course, that's independent of what curriculum standards or international benchmarks might say. And I'm going to start wrapping up now and say, well, to do this, to do assessment better, we have to change the approach. And I'm going to make the general argument that a big part of this is developing assessments or supporting educators to develop assessments that are put in their hands and that is for them to use. So as I start to wrap up, I'm going to start making some ambit claims. I'm going to assert some things. Some of these are opinion, and I hope they'll shape our conversation later. But certainly, if we want to do better, one of the things we need to do is choose valid and reliable outcomes to measure. So I think often as a researcher, certainly in government, we're happy to think in very general terms. You know, if we had a measure of global development, a single number that represents children's learning across all domains, we'd be happy with that, right? Often those things are strongly correlated with the sub-elements of learning anyway. But these are not necessarily the core business of educators. I think we need to think about what is it that we expect educators in classrooms to support children to learn and to do. Almost certainly this is a finite list. You know, we can't have expectations that educators must help children achieve outcomes in all possible domains. Certainly we need to think about, you know, aligning the measurement and the assessment we do with the learning and development frameworks like the STPPA in Indonesia and the early years learning framework in Australia. Most importantly, though, I think we need to start developing assessments that are built around authentic interactions. So less focus on asking parents, can your child do this or can they do that? And more about asking educators and children working together to demonstrate, for children to demonstrate the things that they can do, to elaborate on the things they can do. And coming back to this idea of headline indicators, you know, often we're very interested in the proportion of children who can do something, count to 5, recognize 5 letters from the alphabet. I think I made the point a couple of times in a few slides earlier that this is not particularly useful for educators. You know, if an educator is trying to support children to acquire pre-literacy skills, it's going to be much more useful if they can think in terms of learning progressions. Right? What is the average or typical sequence of skills that children move through from initial abilities, from just emerging within that skill through to more proficient. And of course, coming back to the idea of why we do this, if we do take the time to develop these measures, if we come up with a location on a progression, for example, where children are, we should certainly be developing supporting materials to go along with that. So now that I know where the child is on the progression, help me choose materials, help me choose interactions that are going to support learning, show me where the evidence is. And certainly then assessment can be better embedded in everyday practice. And kind of the crux of this whole presentation is saying, actually, I don't think we need to add more burden to the system by requiring government and requiring researchers and evaluators to come in and do extra measurements and assessment to tell us about the functioning of the system. I think with contemporary assessment programs, if educators are doing good quality assessment in classrooms, we can be creative computer scientists, machine learning experts, whatever we want to couch it in terms of, but we can suck the data we need to out of that system and make statements about the performance of the system overall. So just 2 more slides now. I'm going to show you an example of a measure that I've been developing in New South Wales. This is a measure of early literacy and language development. In the middle here, you can see we developed a whole bunch of authentic interactions, picture book reading activities, storytelling, that live in an item pool, and they cover this, this group of subdomains, strands of oral language and literacy development. And from that, we develop an empirical scale. Certainly, it's got nice linear properties, what we want from a measure. And along this scale, we develop descriptions of how these skills grow and change as children grow and develop. And so if we use this assessment to locate an individual child, we can see what level they're in, we can see what skills they're typically demonstrating, what might typically happen next. I think there's an important point here that these kind of learning progressions are not single sources of truth. Some children have more wobbly development trajectories than others. But also educators can peek in here and get recommendations and advice about what is good pedagogy at this level and what are some examples of practice. Importantly, though, however, it means we can spool up an assessment that's fit for purpose. So if we want a short interaction between adults and children built around a picture book reading activity, for example, we can do that. As educators use the assessment over and over again, there's no need for the child to boringly engage with the same questionnaire items or single form of an assessment. They'll get a different activity each time. We can build up a really rich picture of their development trajectory. Now, if I come at this from a different hat and I'm from government or I'm from a research institute and I want to measure whether this program is effective, whether the system is effective, I argue that we can then create that data set out of this kind of formative assessment program. But if we insist on spooling up our own assessment, well, we can develop out of the same item pool. And in fact, there's no need to bring in some external assessment. This is just some results from the study we ran in New South Wales. I guess there's a couple of things here just out of interest. The densities here are the samples abilities across 3 years. So these are in salmon here, children in pre-kindergarten, so in childcare. The green distribution is children in preschool, and the blue distribution is children in the first year of school. These are the same children. It's a longitudinal study. Just for interest, I want you to realize here that in terms of children's oral language and literacy, this salmon distribution here, the highest achievers in childcare, 3-year-olds typically, are achieving as highly as the lowest achievers in the first and second year of school. So hopefully later we'll have a discussion about, what does teaching at the right level mean? But certainly it's got nothing to do with expectations for age or grade. There's a lot of overlap here. But importantly, you can see that on our measure here, we're capturing a range of skills. So down the bottom here, for example, we might be doing very simple activities with children, games where we ask them to name parts of their body, kind of vocabulary items. A more difficult item up the scale engages with children's oral language. So after having read a picture book, we might ask them to select a picture and tell us why it's their favorite picture. In this example here, we're going to rate them on a rubric in terms of their clarity of expression. And way up the top here, a more challenging question is having read a picture book, we turn to a page in the book that has no words on it. We ask children to recall the narrative. Do they understand what happened in the book, and to recount part of the story to us? What happened at the end of the story? And again, typically we'll be using rubrics here to think about the quality and the expression of children's oral language. This is a picture from the book over here, by the way. But this is just an example. This is me just coming back to this idea that, really is true to say that I think, depending who we are, what kind of sector we work in, we often have very different ideas about what it means to measure learning. I think the core thing here from this presentation is to say, well, really, at the end of the day, we do this kind of measurement because we're interested in supporting educators to do a really good job, high quality job in supporting children to learn. And we can do that through, or we can support that in part at least, by developing really good quality measurement, putting it in the hands of educators and letting them collect evidence about their impact. And the nice thing is because we're creative researchers, from that we can still get all the advantages we want in terms of systems monitoring and program evaluation. But we do have to do a better job, and we have to do a better job because right now the system is not delivering, the everyday market is not delivering for all children. And so I'll leave it there.